Good evening, everyone. Make sure this is on here. So I'd like to begin. I could actually log in here. Okay. So I'd like to begin by actually thanking Diane Cattell and Pedro Nava, who I already know, and the Center for Urban School Partnerships, is that what it's called? For this invitation. And it's actually an invitation really back to Mills College. Some of you very few of you actually know that I used to work here at Mills College before going back to do my PhD. I was actually Assistant Dean of Students and Director of Student Diversity Programs, and I also directed the SOE program, the Summer Academic Workshop. So I have a little bit of a history. This building, of course, wasn't here then, so, but I have a lot of fond memories of faculty and students from the time I was here. So it's good to be back. So my talk today is called Against the Dark, Understanding and Responding to Anti-Blackness in Education. And I'm going to say some uncomfortable things, some radical things, some things you may not like or may find hard to accept. And why is mainly because these are kind of trying times in which each week brings new reports of video accounts, gruesome and haunting accounts of the brutalization and death of Black women, including trans women, Black men, Black children, and each week then brings more rationalization, justification, even celebration of this kind of brutality and death. And of course, too much of it is actually happening in our schools. And this is beyond the everyday suffering, which I think a lot about, of Black children who are just in under-resourced schools, of intentionally concentrated racialized poverty and are being disregarded there. So besides the everyday, I'm thinking about this as being very intentional. And by intentional, I mean to shift the gaze from these schools that serve primarily Black and brown students to the intentional white middle class practice of hoarding educational resources and accumulating more property and wealth in the city at the expense of people of color, and as part of a broader effort to deterritorialize and reclaim our urban home places, all in the name of urban development, or in the name of creating a new Oakland or a new Richmond, and on it goes until you're living way further and further away from where your grandparents lived, where your great-grandparents lived, where your employment is, all of that. So I was thinking about when I moved here from New York in January, and I was trying to get a handle on what's happened since I've been gone, and I had opportunity to go to my cousin's daughter's graduation. So my second cousin here in East Oakland, and I can't remember the name of the school. It was one of those high schools that actually had several in the same rundown building. And it was graduation day, and it was pouring down rain, and the graduation was set to be outside. And so they had all these chairs set up outside, and they were sopping wet, and so you saw everyone kind of come streaming in. And because the parking lot wasn't very large, people were walking blocks down kind of broken sidewalks to get to the building in the pouring rain, grandmothers and aunties and uncles, people in wheelchairs and using canes, and then you had people with a lot of soggy little paper towels trying to wipe down the seats outdoors, much like this, but outdoors, trying to maybe make a seat dry for at least the older members of the families to sit there. And we were all just kind of huddled there, and I was off to the side, huddled under a tree, and there was a woman that was there who said, they wouldn't do this to the white folks. And that's kind of really, that really struck me, and it really is part of how we have to think about anti-blackness is often the things that wouldn't be done to the white folks, the violence, the kind of insult that wouldn't be done, to actually be sitting there with your elderly grandparents in the sopping rain, waiting for the graduation of your child. So this Black mother and grandmother huddled underneath the tree, waiting to see their child or grandbaby graduate, don't need me to come here and offer safe words about equity or diversity or opportunity. Rather, I want to spend some time talking to you very specifically about what seems apparent to so many of us, a widespread disgust and disdain for Black bodies, for Black people, for Black futurity. So I first want to speak to you theoretically about what has come to be called anti-Blackness. This may be the most dense and hardest part of what I have to say today. Next, I want to offer some sense of what that looks like in schools by focusing on some of my own analysis of education as a site of Black suffering, or Black social suffering. And then finally, I want to consider what it might mean to imagine schooling as a site of Black joy. And then I want to leave a lot of time here for us to have an exchange together. While my talk here is mostly about ideas like suffering, dehumanization, and joy, more abstract ideas, liberatory imaginations, in our discussion we might spend more time thinking concretely about how all of this might translate to urban education leadership and classroom practice. But let me begin here at Spring Valley High School. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story and perhaps have seen the video. I hadn't been able to make myself watch it in its entirety until this morning. What we know is that this 16-year-old Black girl wouldn't turn over her cell phone, or she wouldn't leave the room when asked. It's kind of, but she's just sitting there in the chair. And obviously the white police officer, known to the students as Officer Slam, flipped her over in her metal desk and then dragged her across the room before placing her under arrest, resulting in physical injuries to her neck and back and a whole host of emotional and psychic injuries, not only to her, but to every student who was in the room witnessing it, including one of the students who recorded the assault, who was then also arrested. As the women said at my cousin's high school graduation, they wouldn't do this to the white folks. And following all of this, the public discourse revealed some outrage. The officer was fired. However, the sheriff insisted that it was all the girl's fault. And that was a widespread sentiment. People claimed that she deserved everything that came to her, all the brutality, because she refused to obey her teacher. And then on social media, people began to post other videos, old videos, anything they could find, of Black children being unruly in schools. Just Black children, only unruly, and all in an effort to suggest that insubordination, misbehavior, savagery were unique to and inherent in Blackness. So hold that, and let's begin. So anti-Blackness is the central concern and proposition within an intellectual project known as Afro-pessimism. And there's a number of scholars who write in that tradition. Some actually don't identify themselves personally as Afro-pessimists themselves, but they are still included in, they engage ideas around anti-Blackness. So Afro-pessimism theorizes that Black people exist in a structurally antagonistic relationship with humanity. That is, the very technologies and imaginations that allow a social recognition of the humanness of others systematically excludes that possibility for the Black. The Black cannot be human and is not simply an other, but is actually other than human. We often think about, the racial other. In the kind of theorization of anti-Blackness, you have an understanding that really Black is constructed as actually not just an other human, but other than human. And I'll get more into that. So thus, anti-Blackness does not signify a mere racial conflict between human beings that might be resolved through organized political struggle and appeals to the state and to the citizenry, to everybody else, for redress. Instead, anti-Blackness marks an irreconcilability between the Black and any sense of social or cultural regard. The aim of theorizing anti-Blackness is not to offer solutions to racial inequality, but to come to a deeper understanding of the Black condition within a context of utter contempt for and acceptance of violence against the Black. Afro-pessimist scholars contend that the Black, and by the Black I mean even every imagination of things Black, and then the Black body, and then so almost all things Black. So I refer to that in this broader sense of the Black, the kind of construct of the Black. The Black is socially and culturally positioned as slave, dispossessed of human agency, desire, and freedom. This is not meant to suggest that Black people are currently enslaved by whites or by law, but that slavery marks the ontological position of Black people, the sense of being and of understanding Black people. Slavery is how Black existence is imagined and enacted upon, and how non-Black people, and particularly whites, assert their own right to freedom and right to the consumption, destruction, and or simple dismissal of the Black. Through chattel slavery, Frank Wilderson argues, the world gave birth and coherence to both its joys and domesticity and to its struggles of political discontent. And with these joys and struggles, the human was born, but not before it murdered the Black, forging a symbiosis between the political ontology of humanity and the social death of Blacks. This social death of the slave is introduced most explicitly in the work of Orlando Patterson, who detailed how slavery involves a parasitic relationship between slave owner and slave, such that the freedom of the slave owner is only secured and understood in relation to power over the slave. For Patterson, slavery is the permanent violent domination of natally alienated, so alienated at birth, natally alienated and generally dishonored persons. Although slavery involves personal relationships between groups, it also operates as an institutionalized system, maintained through social processes which make it impossible for the slave to actually live as humans might live, or to be regarded as alive for her or himself in the social world. You cannot be for yourself. Things are not for themselves. Only humans can be for themselves, can be alive in the way we understand human life. So this focus on slavery may seem anachronistic in the current historical moment, some 150 years after the formal end of the institution in the United States. However, Wilderson maintains that the relations of power have not changed. He explains that nothing remotely approaching claims successfully made on the state has come to pass. In other words, the election of a black president aside, police brutality, mass incarceration, segregated and substandard schools and housing, astronomical rates of HIV infection, and the threat of being turned away en masse at the polls still constitute the lived experiences of black life. This lived experience serves as a continual reinscribing of the non-humanness of the black, a legitimation of the very anti-blackness which has motivated centuries of violence against black bodies. In this sense, even as slavery is no longer official state policy and practice, the slave endures in the social imagination and also in the everyday suffering by black people. As Saidiya Hartman insists, we are living in what she describes as the afterlife of slavery. She says that black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment. I too, she writes, am the afterlife of slavery. Importantly then, the afterlife of slavery is not only an historical moment, but deeply impressed upon black flesh in the embodiment of the black person as slave. Thus, as Hartman maintains, she is also the afterlife of slavery. Salamisha Tillett makes clear the heaviness of the historical memory, the ever-presence of slavery in black life. She writes, because racial exclusion has become part and parcel of African American political identity since slavery, it cannot simply be willed or wished away. This protracted experience of disillusionment, mourning, and yearning is, in fact, the basis of African American civic estrangement. Its lingering is not just a haunting of the past, but is also a reminder of the present-day racial inequities that keep African American citizens in an indeterminate, unassimilable state as a racialized other. While the affect of racial melancholia was bred in the diet of slavery and democracy, it persists because of the paradox of legal citizenship and civic estrangement. To the extent that we have ample evidence of this civic estrangement of black people, their exclusion from the public sphere, we can theorize that the black is still positioned as the slave, as difficult as it might be to frame a frame to use to understand contemporary race relations, which I'm putting in quotations here, because here race relations is necessarily, because there really can be no relation between master and slave in the way one might conceptualize human relationships. For Afro-pessimists, the black is not only misrecognized, but unrecognizable as human, and therefore there is no social or political relationship to be fostered or restored. As Wilderson argues, our analysis cannot be approached through the rubrics of gains or reversals in struggles with the state and civil society, not unless and until the interlocutor first explains how the slave is of the world. The onus is not on the one who posits the master-slave dichotomy, but on the one who argues there is a distinction between slaveness and blackness. How, when, and where did such a split occur? So we might ask, was it 1865? Was it 1900? 1930-something when lynchings were still happening? 1965 with the Voting Rights Act? When, in this moment, did black get birthed and slaves somehow disappear? Can we even name that moment? So this is the broader challenge posed by a theory of anti-blackness. there is no clear historical moment in which there was a break between slavery and acknowledgement of black citizenship and humanness, nor is there any indication of a clear disruption of the technologies of violence, that is, the institutional structures and social processes that maintain black subjugation. As we see at Spring Valley High, those technologies of violence are still the same, so one wonders, what moment are we in? Are we out of time? Does the black exist out of time, out of temporality? So thus, Afro-pessimists suggest that we must consider the black as still incapable of asking for civil or human rights. This does not deny the long legacy of black racial struggle, but it positions the struggle as an impossibility because the black is still imagined outside of the citizenship that allows claims for redress to be regarded as legitimate or even logical. So part of the challenge in theorizing blackness in contemporary race discourse is that we're living in an officially anti-racist society, in which, as Jody Melamed has documented, post-World War II racial liberalisms and neoliberalisms make some space for the participation of multicultural subjects. That is, even as race continues to structure capitalism, which in turn facilitates white accumulation, the official stance of the state is against racism. Blatantly racist laws and government practices have been declared illegal, and the market embraces outreach to a wide, multicultural range of consumers. In this context, there's a rush to celebrate the social and economic advancement of select black individuals, and perhaps more significantly, the success of other groups of peoples of color. In fact, it is the social and cultural inclusion of non-black people of color that is often offered as evidence of the end of racial animus and racial barriers in the society. Therefore, the failure of large swaths of the black population is purported to be a result of cultural deficits within the black. The slave, always suspected of being lazy and shiftless, now must bear primary responsibility for not making it in a society which, officially anyway, thrives on multiracial harmony and civic participation. Jared Sexton contends that in this era, multiracialism thrives largely at the expense of and firmly against blackness. His argument rests on the premise that the color line is more fluid during periods in which black freedom is thought to be most contained. Thus, during slavery in the US, multiracial communities could serve as buffer classes between whites and blacks, which often corroborated and collaborated with anti-blackness. We would see this also in South Africa, right, during apartheid, with colors in between. The current period is marked by similar dynamics with little organized black political movement, resegregation of neighborhoods and schools, and in fact, an easy deterritorialization and gentrification of historic black urban home places. The current Black Lives Matter movement, which has emerged in the wake of so many cases of anti-black violence, may yet shift us into a period of heightened anxiety about black bodies, but Sexton's description of the current period is valid. There's little fear of black bodies and arguably an emboldened antipathy to the black overall. This, in Sexton's theorizing, opens up new spaces for multiracial inclusion. In this moment, the black-white divide is seen as less consequential and not as much the result of white attitudes and behaviors. In this kind of moment, Sexton maintains the more significant boundary is the one constructed between, as he says, blackness and everything else. And this is a boundary seemingly constructed and maintained by recalcitrant black people against multiracialism, and more to the point, multiracial progress. So in this case, the black stands against the kind of multiracial progress that the society wants to make, were it not just for the blacks holding everything back and kind of keep talking about race and keep not succeeding. You know, they're holding us back from having that ideal neoliberal multicultural society. So embracing non-black bodies of color thus facilitates and is facilitated by anti-blackness and can be justified as anti-racist precisely because it is inclusive of more than white. So the black body, Lewis Gordon contends, is confronted here by the situation of its absence. This absence, the social death or afterlife as of the slave, positions black people as the embodiment of problem, a thing rather than a people, suffering from problems created by anti-blackness. Part of the aim of Afro-pessimist scholarship is to insist on the humanity of black people. As Gordon says, those of us who seek to understand black people need to bear in mind that black people are human beings. That actually has to be said. In an anti-black world, this is easier said than done. In the end, there may be, as Wilderson suggests, no roadmap to freedom so extensive it would free us from the epistemic air that we breathe. Even so, like Gordon, Wilderson suggests that theorizing anti-blackness is important simply as an existential and political recognition of Black humanity, as a means to say we must be free of air while admitting to knowing no other source of breath. That's Wilderson. So what does it mean to suggest that education is a site of anti-Blackness? Fundamentally, it's an acknowledgement of the long history of Black struggle for educational opportunity, which is to say a struggle against what has always been and continues to be a struggle against specific anti-Black ideologies, discourses, representations, maldistribution of material resources, and physical and psychic assault on Black bodies in schools. During the years of state-sanctioned slavery, white slave owners would often beat their Black property for attempting to learn to read. That was their Black property. It wasn't actually a human being at that point in that construct. So for Black people in bondage, learning to read was understood not only as a pathway to economic mobility, but perhaps more importantly, an assertion of their own humanity, a resistance to being propertied. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. A century later, Black children faced down snarling, spitting mobs of white parents and elected officials who were incensed that their own white children would have to sit next to Black children, and fearful that their white education would be sullied by the presence of the Black. And this, then, is the essence of anti-Blackness in education. The Black is constructed as always already problem, as non-human, inherently uneducable, or at very least unworthy of education, and even in a multiracial society, always a threat to what Sexton describes as everything else. So I want to be clear how whiteness and white supremacy are also at the center of anti-Blackness in education. I'm in an article currently under review, which is called Justifying School Inequality, Anti-Black Imaginaries, and the Cultural Political Economy of Urban Education. I contend that in the US, and particularly in this neoliberal moment in the US, the justification of educational and more broadly economic inequality is about defending white entitlement to material advantage, an entitlement to always win. I argue that this entitlement can only be imagined within a social reality in which Black people have lost and continue to lose. I explain that by focusing on Black emotional, moral, and intellectual culpability for their own educational and economic condition, as we saw again in Spring Valley, and not honestly accounting for the influence of social and economic policies intended to advantage whites at the expense of people of color, we create a powerful economic imaginary that is largely devoid of collective will to include the Black as a legitimate recipient of economic support. In fact, economically centered interventions become derided as throwing money at the problem. If the problem can be understood as based in some kind of Black cultural deficiency or behavioral maladaptation, then we have no responsibility to entertain economic proposals or solutions. Further, constructing economic investments in urban schools as throwing money evokes familiar anti-Black racist images of the undeserving Black reaching out hands greedily and lazily, taking something that rightfully belongs to others. At best, appeals for allocating material resources to predominantly Black and brown urban schools are based in empathy. I'll explain that here. So that is, researchers, policymakers, and advocates highlight abject learning conditions, crumbling dangerous infrastructure, and limited access to college preparatory and arts courses and extracurricular programs, all in an effort to garner support for additional funds, which are often in the form of corporate donations, charity drives, or scholarships offered to a small number of exceptional students. This empathy rarely leads to sustained efforts to rethink the allocation of education resources, or to critical examination of how whites benefit from housing and school assignment policies that reproduce white material advantage. And most troublingly, empathetic identification with poor Black children in their underfunded schools can be related, as Saidiya Hartman says, to both the devaluation and valuation of Black life, and I'm about to explain that. So Hartman explains that the economy of chattel slavery precludes developing emotional attachments as property. You don't really have an emotional attachment to it. However, even in this system, Black life can be valued in ways that reify devaluation. So empathy often proceeds by asking whites to imagine themselves in the same dire situation as the Black. Like, imagine you were there. And it is always the most dire situation that is offered here. The reality of systemic maldistribution of resources is not enough to sway hearts. In education, then, we have to present the most tragic circumstances, usually endured by the most ideal and compliant Black students, and often with the most respectable Black parents. There must be evidence of pain and despair, near everyday suffering as a result of education resource inequality, For example, sitting in overcrowded classrooms with rote curricula, that's not enough. It's unconvincing, it's unsatisfying. For Hartman, empathy with the slave is often motivated by white wonderment that anyone could survive under such conditions, and therefore reinforces the notion that the slave is not human. Otherwise, how could they tolerate that? So I'm thinking very concretely, and again, this is an interesting example because it actually relates primarily to Latinos, but it's a way that they get raced and anti-blackness functions in that same way. Think about Martinez, remember the school board meeting in which they had so much money to give for air conditioning, and the one school was primarily white and affluent, and the one school was overwhelmingly working class and mostly Latino. And so the decision was like, who should get this money? And one of the school board members said, well, we should give this air conditioning to this school over here, the white school, because most of them have air conditioning in their homes, so they're used to having this kind of, these students could actually do without air conditioning and still be able to learn because, well, the fields, or whatever. She didn't say that. What she did say was, well, I'm in support of give them some trees, give them tall trees, if we want. That's all I'm really willing to do over there. So, so the mostly Latino school gets tall trees, and then they can sweat it out on the inside because they're more used to that. And this school, their delicate white bodies need air conditioning. So what that means is you have this kind of sense of the kind of endarkened Latino body, kind of like the body itself is sweating it out, and because somehow it has these superhuman capacities. So that's part of what this is when we think about the body. So in the empathy piece, it usually involves a substituting of the slave body with the white one, such that the focus shifts from a recognition of black pain to a centering of what it would mean for the white to endure the suffering. What would this mean for me? So it switches the attention, instead of like actually recognizing the black as human, or in the Martinez case, the endarkened Latino body as human, like what is that like for them? It's more like, well, how would I feel if I had been? So if you're gonna get empathy, you have to kind of somehow, you have to have experienced it yourself. So you see this in politicians who, right-wing politicians who are totally against various things until they have a relative who's gay, or until they have a relative who has cancer and needs health care, and all of a sudden now they're in support of things, but they couldn't see other people as human until it somehow was in their life. And as wonderful as that may be, you almost hope that they have all these maladies just in order to kind of understand what the rest of us are going through. So Hartman says that we need to consider whether the identification forged at the site of suffering confirms black humanity at the peril of reinforcing racist assumptions of limited sentience. So even those Latino kids there, they're not really human. Such that the humanity of the enslaved and the violence of the institution can only be brought into view by extreme examples of incarceration and dismemberment, or by placing white bodies at risk. What does it mean that the violence of slavery or the pained existence of the enslaved, if discernible, is only so in the most heinous and grotesque examples and not in the quotidian routines, the routines of slavery? So these videos that go viral are always the most extreme, and there's blood and there's people laying on the street for 4 hours, and those are the only things that move. The everydayness, I mean, if you were to look at Ferguson and you saw the body of Mike Brown on the street, you shouldn't need to see that when you actually know the way racial segregation works in Ferguson, the way school resource allocation works, but that's not gruesome enough. You actually have to see a body dead on the street in order for it to kind of move the heart. So calls for empathetic offerings of educational resources are also susceptible to devaluing black life in another way, through celebration of efforts that assist a few with no intention to support transformative economic policies that would improve schooling conditions for the great majority of black children and communities. So here it is, the fungibility or kind of exchangeability. They're like trading cards. The black is like, here's one, they're just as good as the other. They're not really human, so they're things. So you trade them on the stock market, or on the auction market, actually. So here, in the fungibility of the slave allows one to stand in for all. By helping any one given black child or minority school, the empathetic white receives credit for addressing racial inequality, and the public collectively imagines that all black children have thereby been helped. So thus, says Hartman, while the beaten and mutilated body presumably establishes the brute materiality of existence, the materiality of suffering regularly eludes recognition by virtue of the bodies being replaced by other signs of value as well as other bodies. So, you're helping somebody. So it's this fascination with black suffering and the ensuing political spectacle of economic aid to the black. e.g. the Darkened Child organization, school, giving some money to some black people somewhere. It allows a symbolically, largely voluntary approach to school resource equality, in which anything black, is offered aid without intent to systematically interrogate or resist the racialized maldistribution of capital. So economic and educational inequality are justified because the white public is offering something to some fungible black bodies somewhere at any given time. So as long as somebody's being helped, you can kind of put that forward in the media or in the public eye and use that as, we do care. We're not doing anything systemic. We're not doing anything for most of them, but as long as we're helping somebody, they're just some black as good as any black. So we don't really need to think about all of them as human as long as we're treating somebody with some kind of regard. So we might call this the Miss Millie effect. You remember her from The Color Purple? How many people are old enough how many people have seen The Color Purple? Is this getting to be a dated reference here? So Miss Millie in The Color Purple, she basically runs into Miss Sophia on the street and says, well, how'd you like to be my maid? And Miss Millie says, no, hell no. And so she says, what'd you say to me, girl? And then she said, I said, hell no. And then her husband comes, you know the scene, right? So her husband comes over and says, what did you say to my wife? And she said, I said, hell no. And he slaps her, and then she punches him, and then she ends up in prison for over a decade, and she ends up being Miss Millie's maid anyway. And then Miss Millie offers to, she said, I'll let you go see your family for one day, for the whole day, she says, for Christmas. And then she drives over there, and she taught Miss Millie how to drive. Miss Millie couldn't figure out how to drive, so she says, oh, I'm sorry, you're going to come back with me 5 minutes after she's gotten in the house to spend time with her family. And it gets this whole thing, and so some of Miss Sophia's relatives are out there saying, like, well, can't you just let her stay? And so she gets really scared, and so she says, I've always been good to you people. I've always gone out of my way for the colors. So I'm calling this the Miss Millie effect, this kind of sense of I've done something, and so therefore I can see myself as self-righteously anti-racist, no matter what I've done or contributed to or I'm complicit with structurally. So I wanted to focus on that so we can understand that white supremacy is at the center of anti-blackness and manifests in policy, pedagogy, and everyday practice in ways that make schooling a site of black suffering. And so this is the second part of my talk here. And this is actually a scene from Seattle, kind of the beginning of school. This would have been about my time, going to school in Seattle and beginning to be bused to the opposite side of the city, to white affluent areas to go to school. And so I'm going to highlight a selection from a recent article in the journal Race, Ethnicity and Education, which is called Losing an Arm, Schooling as a Site of Black Suffering. And in this article, I draw on data from my historical ethnographic study of the cultural politics of school desegregation in Seattle, which is my own hometown. And I explore suffering as a recurring theme in the narratives of 4 black leaders, educators, and activists who are involved in the struggle for black educational opportunity in that city since the post-civil rights era. I contend here that for many black children and families, schooling is a site of suffering. Schooling is not merely a site of suffering, but I believe that it is the suffering that we've been the least willing or able to acknowledge or give voice to in educational scholarship, and particularly in school desegregation scholarship. So I want to share just 2 of the narratives from that piece, which highlight not just black suffering, but also how black educators and parents push back against anti-blackness in schools. So after that first section, which was very much heavy around death and disdain, you get actual agency against that as well. So I don't want to leave you with the thought that people do not push back against that. So this is a selection from that article and from my work in Seattle. So sitting on the hardwood floor of Mrs. Bunny Wilburn's living room one afternoon, I talked with Wilburn and 3 other women, Annette Perfect, Edith Giles, and Zakiya Stewart, about their years of activism leading the work of the Seattle chapter of the Black Child Development Institute, which is an organization with a long history of education advocacy for black youth and parents. One by one, they introduced themselves. Wilburn, who is the eldest, speaks first. A retired nurse, she describes how she made the choice to send her daughter, who had attended parochial schools since kindergarten, to Roosevelt High School in the North End in the 1960s during the years of the voluntary racial transfer program. In the 1960s, it sounds very ominous. And obviously the North End is the primarily white area that it's hard for anybody who is not white to live in. The housing contracts would say, no Negroid, Mongoloid, or Malay shall live in this, domicile. So those were legal. So she said, I wanted her to get a sense of the real world, Also, Black leaders were encouraging members of the community to send their children to North End schools. I like to see myself as someone who is down for the cause, she says proudly. Psychologist Zakiya Stewart went next. I have to say that Bunny nurtured me and Edith radicalized me, she says laughing. Sitting next to her on the sofa, Edith Giles laughs. I ain't radicalized nobody, she says playfully. Both of Stewart's children are adults now, but much younger than Wilburn's. She speaks about benefiting from the earlier generation's experience in integrated schools. As she asked around the community in the mid-1980s, the assessment was bleak. The academic performance piece was missing, she explains, and it seemed as if you put them on the bus, that meant they were going to be suspended at one point or another during that school year. I made a conscious decision not to send my children there. Edith Giles, who was a teacher in the Seattle schools for many years, is also retired. I had met her a few weeks ago at the local senior center, and she had helped arrange this day's discussion. She had made her perspective very clear at that first meeting. She says, one of the things we as a people don't understand is even among the majority population, even those who support us, they're only going to go so far. They have an agenda. That's just how white folks are. And Black folks don't seem to understand that. The buck is going to stop there, and it's going to stop on their side of the fence. Even though there may be broad support for reforms such as school desegregation, she said, there's a whole nother agenda. And maybe they're not even conscious of it, but it's there. We need to figure out what we need to do for us, making our own decisions without being dependent on anybody else. Since Giles and I had already had an initial conversation, we all turn our attention to Annette Perfect, who until this moment has been sitting quietly, listening. Now she puts her head down and begins to weep. Someone offers her a box of tissues. After a few moments, she looks up. I'm sitting here listening to them, she says slowly, and we're all different. They have husbands. I'm a single mother with 2 sons who have been through the Seattle School District. And the big picture for the United States, America, they, whoever it is, they have a plan, we have a plan. I want my kids to be able to read, write, do math, get a job, take care of their children, hold a decent conversation. But they feel because I'm a single parent, my kids are less, that I'm not interested in my kids. And because I'm a single parent, their father is either a pimp or a drug dealer or some wonderful thing, and I'm sleeping with anything and everything out in the street, and I don't care about my children. I don't know where they get this from. I care as much about my kids as they do. But I have a fight all the way from day one until she pauses, searching for the words. They're in the box. She begins to cry again. I feel that they work very hard on Black males from the first day they go into school. The other women nod and say, mm-hmm. I've worked in the school district, she says, noting her many years as a cafeteria worker. I'm retired and I'm working back in the school district, and I'm seeing the same plan there as when my kids were there. But it's more out there, and they don't care. Perfect remembers the day her youngest son got suspended from Eckstein Middle School, a desegregated school in the city's predominantly white North End, which I was also bused to around that same time. What was the story about this? She says, sighing. Okay. Him and the little white boy were out on the gym floor. My son had the ball, and the white boy wanted the ball and said, give me that ball, nigger. And my son done the way he was trained. He whipped his ass good, and he better, because that's how I trained him. He better not go to school and start no fight, but if it starts, he better end it. I laugh knowingly. Yes, I tell her, nodding. My mom told me that too. That's just the way I am, she says. They suspended my son for 3 days and didn't even tell me. She took her son to the school the next day to confront the principal. I asked him, what happened to the other child? He said, I had to take him home and explain to his parents why he had a bloody nose. But nobody came to my house. Nobody called me. Nobody said a word. So anyway, I looked at my son and I looked at the principal and I said, yes, he did exactly what I told him. If anybody ever calls you a nigger in life, you better whip his ass and whip his ass good, because if you don't, I'm gonna whip yours when you get home. And the principal did not understand that. But I said, he's not gonna lay down and let somebody walk all over him. He better not. I got a bad attitude, she says, laughing bitterly. But I've got 2 sons, and I'm trying to get them grown without them going wherever it is we go, to jail or wherever it is. So that was Annette Perfect. And the second person I want to focus on is Elnora Hookfin. Seattle schools recruited Elnora Hookfin from historically Black Grambling State in the mid to late 70s. She was my former home economics teacher at Eckstein Middle School in the early days of the busing program. And she spent much of her career working in the affluent and mostly white North End of the city. And I found her, when I was doing my dissertation, in the South End, beginning her 3rd year as vice principal at Rainier Beach High School, which is a school that is built for a couple thousand and really only has 400-something students because it's racially segregated, mostly Black. White people will not go to that school. She said, I had worked in the North End forever, and I wanted to see what was going on. And this is one of the schools that was struggling. I could have retired yesterday. I don't have to be here. I want to be here. She tells a story about how during her first year she noticed that one teacher would allow large groups of students to sit at the back of the class braiding each other's hair. I had to put a stop to that. I'm reminded that a few days before our interview, I had stumbled across quotes from Rainier Beach students posted on an online website, greatschools.org. Most had been posted a few years ago, around the time that students had staged a protest over the lack of textbooks and other supplies. I shared this one with Mrs. Hookfin from a student. Nobody listens to Rainier Beach. They think we are only good for our sports. If we had things to let us work better academically, like books, computers, and better teachers and tutors, then we would be an above-average school. I work hard at my school, and nobody recognizes that because they are too busy recognizing how much better other schools are. Just because we are a primarily black school doesn't mean we can't learn. Teach us. I don't want to leave high school knowing almost nothing. Please give us some things to make us learn. Why get up so early to be treated stupid? I hope somebody reads this. Let me address that, Mrs. Hookfin said, suddenly sounding stern, because the kids are so right on with that. They were working with ancient computers up until 2 or 3 years ago. They've been updated. We do need a stronger curriculum. We don't have that. However, she notes, black students and other students of color are still marginalized throughout the district, not just at Rainier Beach. This is still going on, she said. We talk about closing the achievement gap, but we have to take a look at what we're doing to our kids. And if you go to a school, say at Roosevelt High School, Roosevelt is going to take care of the honors kids, but the other kids, they're probably going to place them on one wing, on a floor all by themselves, and let them tear it up. Garfield is also guilty of that, which is another highly ranked school. Although they have the largest AP program, they also have the largest group of misbehaving students because they plop them together and give them the worst teachers who cannot gain control, who are not motivated, who are not educated, so her voice trails off. We never really desegregated. We remain a sophisticated, segregated system. How did we do that? We came up with something called the honors program. So kids were bused, but were not placed in honors. And kids were bused and placed with some of the worst teachers we had in the building. So desegregation had its advantages and its disadvantages. It helped the big picture. At least you were able to sit on the bus wherever you wanted to sit and go anywhere you wanted to go, that kind of thing. But as far as education, it was not fixed because teachers are still teaching in a segregated way. Remember how we were talking about the kids allowed to sit at the back of the room and do whatever they wanted to do, braiding each other's hair? That's all part of that. Until we fix that kind of teaching, we're still in a segregated system. Students at schools such as Rainier Beach, she insists, are not going to have the same educational advantages that, say, Roosevelt has because we don't have the money. So the kids that have the money backing are going to get the best. So we're right back. I think we're right. We're worse than we were before we desegregated. It's ugly, but it's real. So there's so much to analyze in these narratives, and I do much of that work in the article. I'm presenting them here as testimony to the ways that black subjects interrogate and refuse anti-blackness and continue to believe. So the work that they're engaged in is always theory and flesh, theory and bone, theory and soul, all at the same time. So that brings me to the third part. What does this work do? What are imperatives in imagining schools as sites of black joy? I think we have to begin with an understanding of the liberatory possibilities of school and how the black educational imagination, the ways that black people engage in understanding the meanings of education, is one in which, first, education could serve as an assertion of black humanity, and second, in which education might serve as resistance to or protection from white supremacy. So I'm going to consider each of those in turn. So thinking about education as an assertion of black humanity, historian James Anderson documents a number of stories of slave literacy during the antebellum period. Thomas Jones, a slave in North Carolina, suffered 3 beatings in order to hide his books from his master. It seemed to me, Thomas Jones noted, that if I could learn to read and write, this learning I really thought it would point out the way to freedom, influence, and a real secure happiness. Enoch Golden, the slave who taught countless others to read, was reported to have said on his deathbed that he, quote, been the death of many a nigger reported to have, because he taught so many to read and write. So once they learned that you could read and write, often they would kill you. And former slave Louisa Guase recalled, white people never teach colored people nothing but to be good to their massa and me. What learning they could get in them days, they didn't get it at night, taught themselves. For Anderson, that so many black people, both during and immediately following slavery, risked their lives for the sake of literacy reveals the important cultural significance of education for black people in that time. Education not only had a utilitarian economic benefit, but was also understood as a means toward recognition as full members of the human family. Of course, part of the rationale for slavery was that Negroids, which is pseudo-biological terms, did not possess the intellectual or creative capacity of whites because they were somehow biologically closer to primates, to monkeys. In this sense, education becomes a testimony to Black humanity, a way for Black people to move as far away from possible from an existence in which Black signified an object or an animal, that is the property, or quite literally the beast of burden of white people. The historical trajectory of that goes far beyond slavery. Du Bois, writing in the 1930s, expressing his concerns about school desegregation, argued that the highest priority for Black people should be ensuring that their children attended schools where they were loved and cared for. So we wouldn't want to be making a political point at the expense of the humanity of Black children. That was his theory that the school desegregation politics were doing. He writes, "In the case of the education of the young, you must consider the relation of the children to life. I have repeatedly seen wise and loving colored parents take infinite pains to force these little children into schools where the white parents despised and resented the dark child, made mock of it, neglected or bullied it, and literally rendered its life a living hell. Such parents want their child to fight this thing out, but dear God, at what a cost. We shall get a finer, better balance of spirit by putting children in schools where they are wanted and where they are happy and inspired, than in thrusting them into hells where they are ridiculed and hated." I'm recalling at AERA, which is the education conference, a couple of years ago. I was talking about this, and Gloria Ladson-Billings, the senior scholar in our field, was on the panel, and she said, well, when we fought for school desegregation, we knew that we were making a deal with the devil, in many ways. And that's really carrying that metaphor, the sense of many of these desegregated schools or integrated schools as living hells, which then aligns well with this notion of, yes, it's a deal with the devil, but they thought there was a higher purpose, at least for a number of years until that hell seemed to burn the children too much. And that's what Du Bois was warning about in the 1930s here in terms of sending our children into a living hell where they're not loved and cared for. So for Du Bois, schools could either serve to affirm or diminish Black humanity. Part of the reason Du Bois was so vehement in his critique of school desegregation is because he envisioned education as a site in which Black children learn to love themselves and their people and begin to develop their spirit, which is his word, which is very much an understanding of themselves as fully human. Only humans have this kind of sense of spirit. So we see this narrative emerge repeatedly and consistently, specific to the treatment of Black students in both segregated and so-called integrated schools throughout the 20th century and even into the present. So, in this notion of education as resistance to white supremacy, so a key element of affirming Black humanity is maintaining resistance to white supremacy. As Cornel West has noted, Black cultural workers need to, this is quote, examine and explain the historically specific ways in which whiteness is a politically constructed category parasitic on Blackness. Identifying these parasitic practices and finding sword, shield, and balm, anything you can to protect you, to struggle against and to heal from the white supremacist assault becomes a necessary function of Black pedagogy and thus a prominent narrative in Black education discourses. In Toni Morrison's beloved, Baby Suggs delivers a sermon in which she urges Black people to love themselves and to do so also as a conscious rejection of white supremacist constructions of Black worthlessness. So this is from her, and you may recognize this if you've read Beloved. Here, in this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh, they despise it. Love your hands, love them, raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face because they don't love that either. You got to love it, you. What Morrison narrates here as a pedagogy of resistance is replicated in real, or that is non-fictional, Black educational contexts. A couple authors talk about Black supplementary schools in the United Kingdom. They describe these spaces as spaces of radical Blackness, and they're perceived as threats to the white majority because they're not simply defensive institutions, but counter-public spheres wherein Black subjects learn how to oppose the hegemony of whiteness, so they don't internalize that sense of white being over them. Vanessa Siddle Walker, in her historical ethnographic account of a segregated black school in the US South, recounts that black teachers would tell their students that they need to do better than whites. Said music teacher Evan Reed, there may be a time when you have to compete against white people. You don't want your work to be equal. You want your work to be better. You don't want, and as the school principal would insist, you have to be better. It shouldn't be that way, but that is the way it is. Once again, we see education as a space of resistance against whiteness as hegemonic ideology and in regard to actual academic excellence. For these black educators, black students not only have to resist white supremacy in their minds, but defy it in their accomplishments. So, black narratives on education are replete with reminders that white people benefit from keeping black people undereducated. In Lupe Fiasco's song, Dumb It Down, the hip-hop artist critiques black people who insist that he should dumb down his lyrics because, as they complain in a number of choruses, this is right from the song, we ain't graduated from school, nigga, them big words ain't cool, nigga. However, these black responses to his work are also echoed in another chorus by a white male speaker who also urges Lupe to dumb it down, but for different reasons. And this is a quote from his song. You've been shedding too much light, Lou. You're making them want to do right, Lou. They're trying to graduate from school, Lou. They're starting to think that smart is cool, Lou. They're starting to get up out the hood, Lou. I'll tell you what you should do. Dumb it down. And in the live video for this song, these lyrics are delivered authoritatively by a stout, middle-aged white man in stereotypically conservative khakis and a polo shirt, who is then laughed off the stage. Thank you, Mr. White Man, Lupe says sarcastically as the crowd laughs, as he's kind of claps and as he's kind of ushered off the stage. So this kind of thank you but no thank you response to white supremacy is invaluable in creating and nurturing black joy in schools. And we have to understand that white people do not necessarily have to reproduce that. There's a difference between white people and whiteness. But in taking on that and kind of in defending that whiteness, then in choosing that, in choosing whiteness over humanity, then they end up helping to recreate black suffering. So part of what black joy needs is more whites to choose otherwise than whiteness. So I'm going to finally end on this with a piece on black joy that is also at the end of a forthcoming article in the journal Urban Education that I co-authored with Berkeley doctoral candidate Keon Ross. In that article, Be Real Black for Me, Imagining Black Crit in Education, we attempt to work out what it means to theorize the specificity of black existence in education within and kind of in response to critical race theory. So you may be familiar with critical race theory. There's also emerged a sense of Lat crit and Asian crit, tribal crit, just all in a way to kind of think more specifically about how the manifestation of raciality kind of works in those contexts. But there's not really been much of a black crit because I think part of the assumption was that critical race theory was, in some sense, black crit. And we argue that it really isn't a theorization, not on the level of what I've been talking about here in terms of what it means to theorize blackness and anti-blackness. So we try to begin some of that work. So one of the major commitments that we say a black critical theory would have to have is that the work would have to proceed from a deep love for black people. And we write at the end of this last section, and it's interesting, it's deep love for black people because the song, anybody know that song Be Real Black for Me? It's by Donny Hathaway and Roberta Flack. Please go YouTube it tonight. And go YouTube it tonight. Listen to it. It's kind of, in many ways, the song is not intended, it's obviously Roberta Hathaway and Donny Hathaway, in a sense, singing to each other, but really the song is really a love letter to black people and blackness. So Be Real Black for Me is the name of the song. Anyway, this is the last section of this essay. As part of refusing to make peace with the war on black people, Assata Shakur ends her autobiography with a poem entitled The Tradition. While this poem is a recognition and celebration of the trajectory of black resistance, it also serves as a call to action. She writes, in tales told to the children, in chants and cantatas, in poems and blues songs and saxophone screams, we carried it on. In classrooms and churches, in courtrooms and prisons, we carried it on. On soapboxes and picket lines, welfare lines, unemployment lines, our lives on the line, we carried it on. On cold Missouri midnights, pitting shotguns against lynch mobs, on burning Brooklyn streets, pitting rocks against rifles, we carried it on. Carried on the tradition, carried a strong tradition, carried a proud tradition, carried a Black tradition, carry it on, pass it down to the children, pass it down, carry it on now, carry it on to freedom. Ultimately, Kiana Ross and I offer that Black crit carry it on from a place of love, not just a love for the Harlem Renaissance or the Civil Rights Movement, but for love for loud colors and loud voices, love for sagging pants, hoodies, and corner store candies, love for gold grills and belly laughs on hot summer porches. Carry it on as a site of struggle, as engaging with the historical and contemporary yearning to be at peace, as forging refuge from the gaze of white supremacy, where Black children dream weightless, unracialized, and human, where language flows freely and existence is nurtured and resistance is breath, where the Black educational imagination dances wildly into the night, quenching the thirst of yearning and giving birth to becoming.